Hey everyone, this is just a quick follow-up to my previous video which detailed 6 start positions in Imperator Rome and discussed and showed off some initial gameplay. That video had a lot of people understandably asking questions and asking for a lot more videos. That was a sponsored video, which is why I was able to show gameplay, but remember, those videos are purely information only. I'm not able to show gameplay or give my opinion on what I've played until the embargo date. Now the next start position video from me should be in a couple of weeks as per my agreement with Paradox. Now I can still talk about how the game works as all the information is out there in the developer diaries, so I'm going to tackle some of the biggest questions to keep everyone kind of up to date. Now the first one was the start date. Many comments have pointed out historical inaccuracies for the year 450 BC. And this is because the game isn't set at 450 BC, it's set at 450 AUC, which is after the founding of Rome. Now at any time you can hover over the date and it'll give you the BC version. 450 AUC is 304 BC, so the game starts at 304 BC and there's no other start dates. The next one is culture. In the previous video, I mentioned something along the lines of Armenian being of Persian culture. Now what I meant to say was that they're part of the Persian culture group. In Imperator Rome, there's around 20 culture groups across the entire map. These are obviously quite large and broad, but within them there's also about 20 subcultures. Armenia are of Armenian culture in the Persian culture group, just like Rome are Roman culture inside the Latin culture group. So what does this mean? Well, if you have a pop that is part of the same culture, then there's no problems with that pop, no negative to happiness, everything's all good. If you have a pop that's a different culture, but still part of the same culture group, then there's just a minus 10% debuff to happiness. Now if you have a pop that's a different culture and part of a different culture group, then you get a minus 30% debuff to happiness. Now the lower happiness is for a pop, the more they contribute to unrest for the entire province, and the more unrest a province has, the less productive the entire province will be. So you could have one city with really high unrest contributing quite a lot and bringing the entire province down, potentially. So, in the case of Armenia, they are fully Armenian, but are part of the Persian culture group, and that gives them the Persian military traditions. And that also gives them the option to form Persia as a decision. Now whether or not Armenia would ever change their name like that to something like Persia, that's up for you guys to debate. This raises the question of, can you change your state culture? As far as I can tell, you cannot. I think possibly through events it might be able to happen, but even if your ruler is a different culture or religion, I don't think it changes for the state. Some countries start with the state culture being in the minority, like Bactria, so it's interesting gameplay to kind of try and pull yourself out of that. But I think it would be nice if decisions or laws could allow you to, over time, convert the state culture if certain conditions were met. The next topic is resources. Why can't Athens build a navy? I hear you cry. Well, historically the Athenian navy was at its height during the Peloponnesian War about 150 years prior to the events in Imperator Rome. Athens has since lost almost all of her holdings and is a client of Phrygia now. Now in terms of gameplay, they can't even start building a navy because they don't have the wood resource, and there's wood really close by actually at Delphi, which 150 years ago they would have occupied. Now, I can understand the argument that they should just be able to build a navy anyway. There's probably enough wood and trees around them to do so in the provinces they own, but this game is focused heavily on trading for what you need. I like to imagine the cities produce resources not only because of what's there, but because perhaps that's where the production chain and manpower is to do it. If you need hundreds of triremes, perhaps the infrastructure and available workforce just isn't there for you to do so. It might be a bit of a stretch, but that's just, I don't know, how I like to think about it. Now, the good news is there is about 12 countries willing to trade with wood with you right at the beginning with Athens. So you can immediately start to build a navy should you wish. Now, I guarantee you, as Athens, you will have much bigger priorities than building your little tiny navy. You simply won't have the money to maintain anything substantial anyway. So take a few surrounding cities in Hellas, restore the Athenian Empire, then we'll talk navy. Next question I got a lot was, can you play XCountry? Yes, you can play every country you want. You just click them and away you go. Now you'd have to assume that some countries have more events than others, and maybe the traditions make a little bit more sense for other countries over others, but everything else is kind of the same. There's only 4 buildings in the game: markets for commerce, training camps for manpower, forts for defense, and granaries for growth. There's no country-specific buildings or country-specific units. Now, in terms of buildings, everything's kind of replaced with the resources. You know, typically buildings in some of the other games give you like a little bit of extra this, a little bit of extra that. You get that from the resources by shifting them around. That's kind of like your building system. For units, there's no country-specific units. Now there's 9 unit types, and based on your traditions is what will change the stats of those unit types. So Greek heavy infantry fundamentally is the same as Roman heavy infantry, but Romans will eventually get buffs to certain things like discipline and morale, and get abilities such as building roads with their armies and so on. Greeks, for instance, get traditions for cavalry to emulate the Tarentine light cavalry and things like that. The idea, I think, is that people are basically the same no matter where they come from, but the traditions and the culture they're in will change what they do and what they're good at. It also allows you to have hundreds of countries without needing bespoke art or balance for hundreds of units, I guess. Now this is why when people say Rome's gonna be OP, you have to think about it like this. Etruria is Latin, so is Rome. They both share the same tradition, so technically on the field, they fight the same. Now some other things can occur, like laws such as the Marian reforms or resources giving global buffs to units, but fundamentally everyone's foundation is the same. Now I know for fans of Total War especially, this is kind of weird. You expect to be dealing with recruiting Hastati, Principes, Triarii, coming up against Macedonian phalanxes, but it's all just heavy infantry. Now, combat is complex enough and hard enough to predict as it is, that having hundreds of units might just be a little bit unnecessary. But again, good news with this, I guess, is that units can easily be added in modding. It's basically just text on your screen and data behind them. So I've no doubt that modding will create bespoke categories of units for key nations. Should be quite interesting to see how that kind of fits in and plays out. In terms of, is Rome OP? They do have a pretty strong start in Italy, so unless Etruria and the Samnites kind of gang up against them, they're not going to be, nothing's really going to stop them early on anyway. Now a quick question about chokepoints was, can mountains be crossed by armies with some sort of penalty? No, there's large swaths of mountain ranges and deserts that are totally impassable. There is also heavy attrition areas that you can go through for penalties and things like that, but some areas are just a no-go. As sometimes these areas do actually spawn barbarians over time. They kind of build up and then invade, so you'll have to deal with them. The next one is, why does Rome have one consul? Effectively, this is a simplification in my mind, but I'll discuss at least why I think it's been done. Imperator Rome makes you play as the ruler of a nation. The ruler that is in power is you. All decisions you make reflect on him or her, and your income to power resources is based on that person as well. Almost all dilemmas are something that they decide on, and the ramifications of which are something that affects them. You effectively work your other characters to get the best rulers into power to give you more income. So I can understand that if this changed every year, which is about 5 to 10 minutes of gameplay, a few things would happen. You wouldn't form a bond with your ruler, you wouldn't care as much who got in power, you'd have too many candidates over time to recognize anyone, and you'd have wildly unpredictable incomes. Now before people cry, oh I bet it's coming in DLC, Johan has stated that if they ever do 2 consoles, it'll be a free update, but he doesn't think it's going to work, so we'll have to hold him to that at least. Now personally, I think they should have figured out a way to at least represent it. The Senate can block actions based on their votes, for instance, so I personally think that the second consul could have just been a modifier to that, another character in power that if you weren't on good terms with them, it'd be harder to get stuff done and vice versa. Again, it's a gross simplification, but at least it would sort of still be there. The larger problem is, I think ultimately if you wanted a deep Roman politics game, the entire game design of Imperator just does not fit it. The timescale would need to be changed, and there'd need to be way more intrigue with characters. This game, in my mind, is a cross between CK2 and EU4, but it doesn't combine them together. It takes elements from both, meaning it's not quite as deep for characters as CK, and it's not quite as deep for empire building as EU, but it is a middle ground between the two, where it's just as deep overall, at least that's what I can gather. I think Paradox are going to have a hard time satisfying both player bases here, because obviously the CK players will wonder why can't you do X, Y, and Z with your characters, and the EU players will wonder why is there less building options or specific historical events. Sacrifices have seemingly had to be made in order to get the best of both worlds. And that's it for this video. If people have more questions or things they'd like to know, fire away in the comments. All of this information is also available on the Paradox forums for their developer diaries, and you can see them playing in the Dev Clash, but I don't mind doing videos like this if this one does well, so make sure to give it a like and a share with people you think might be interested, and I'll be doing guides and things closer to release when I can to help ease people into the game. I know there's a lot of people new to this type of game as well, and it can be a little bit daunting, but it's quite easy to learn when it's broken up into smaller pieces. As always, if you want to find players who like similar games to this, consider joining our Discord where we run community games each month. Soon we're actually playing a big game of Stellaris, and I'll be running them for Imperator if we get enough support for that. If you want to support this channel directly and increase the amount of videos and community games we run, consider supporting on Patreon, like these lovely people on screen did. Get yourself a fancy Roman rank and join the exclusive Senate House on our Discord. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.